All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So we have wrestled many times with trying to understand verses that have given us a lot of trouble, trying to figure out how to unpack and understand what the words mean. But what do you do when you come across a verse that doesn't seem to be teaching you anything at all? So specifically, it doesn't seem to be teaching you anything new. Does the Torah repeat itself just for effect? Did it forget that it had mentioned something previously and that the repetition is completely unnecessary?
Maybe it wants to emphasize how important the point is.
Perhaps it's trying to emphasize the point as a sort of poetic repetition, as a way of saying, no, really, I meant this is important. We also say sometimes perhaps the restatement is teaching us a new aspect of the original statement. What we're going to see today is a restatement that seems entirely unnecessary from the point of view of the commentators. You may not think it's unnecessary when we first read it. And the direction that it is taken by our tradition will hopefully help us better understand how it is we take the Torah and turn it into halakha, turn it into a way that we actually live, as opposed to a book that we just happen to read. All right, with that introduction, let's get down to work. We are in the parasha of Vayakhel for our study today, and that's going to be at the beginning of the parasha, conveniently. So page 552, if you're in the Eitz Chaim, or chapter 35, verse 1, if you are in any other Chumash or Torah. How are we doing? Good? Good. Who wants to read? This is going to be our shortest English reading of the year, probably. We've only got a tiny bit that we want to cover. Please.
Moses then convoked the whole Israelite community and said to them, "These are the things that the Lord has commanded you to do. On 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day you shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. You shall kindle no fire throughout your settlements on the Sabbath day." And Moses said further to the whole community of Israelites, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Take from among you gifts to the Lord. Everyone whose heart so moves him shall bring them gifts for the Lord: gold, silver, and copper, blue, purple, and crimson yarns, fine linen."
Wait. Hold on. Okay, let's stop there. Hold on a second. Holy awkward juxtapositions, Batman.
Yes.
We start off, Moses convenes everybody and tells them,
remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy.
do Shabbat.
Yeah.
Pardon?
Go to shul, but decorate the shul nicely.
Exactly
right.
But hold on, he says keep Shabbat.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden we're getting God's shopping list.
Yeah, right.
You know, it's the God's wedding registry. And since this was the union of God and Israel, that is actually an appropriate metaphor. But what do the two have to do with each other? Why in the world would we stick this discussion of keeping Shabbat with this getting down to brass tacks, or bronze tacks, as the case may be, with the building of the Mishkan? I mean, were we talking about Shabbat generally before we got here? No. So what's going on right here? The short answer is, no. But that's not, of course, the way the sages take it.
They take it as, you're going to do work on 6 days, this is some of the work you're going to do. And on the seventh day you're going to rest, and this is the place you're going to rest at, this tabernacle that you make.
Well, you're not going to rest at the tabernacle,
Well,
but more specifically, you will rest from building the tabernacle. So the halakha of Shabbat, the 39 av melachot, the 39 categories of labor that we are primarily restricted from, and then they have sub categories and applications, as well as other issues of what we do or don't do on Shabbat. But the 39 biggies of the things we don't do, which are going to be in the handout, don't worry, are derived from this section reminding us to keep Shabbat and its proximity to the building of the tabernacle. With the notion being that if you don't build the tabernacle on Shabbat, then all the more so anything that would be involved in building on the tabernacle shouldn't be done for any other reason. if for the most holy item that is going to be in your community, you're not allowed to, saw a beam in half, then you're certainly not allowed to saw a beam in half just to fix your barn on Shabbat. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the first time it does make sense, actually. I knew where they got the word from. That's the first time. The juxtaposition is what makes it, what I really get.
Is where it hangs together.
Where it hangs from. Because otherwise you say, how did they pull this out of thin air? No.
Right, now we'll sort of give them our agreement and our nod of assent that makes some logic, and in a different class maybe we'll argue about how well they hang it or don't hang it, but there's still something left over from that discussion that seems out of place. There's still a phrase in this opening paragraph that just is like, well, why did you have to tell me that too?
You shall kindle no fire.
Yeah. Fire. Why would mentioning fire seem completely superfluous and redundant? Like those two words, by the way.
And
Fibulous. No, not quite that. Well, what have we been told previously about Shabbat? In the earlier sections of Shemot.
Is that the one where we couldn't have firewood?
No, that comes later.
That comes later.
Well, there's a guy who gathers the
That's
firewood
and
who gets punished for it,
You
yes.
can't have firewood, you can't build a fire.
Well,
Yeah.
yes and no,
Okay.
but what are we told generally about Shabbat? What is the restriction on Shabbat? Work, right? No work, right? No malacha, no work. Well, if I'm not allowed to do any work, does that mean I'm allowed to fix my carburetor? If I had a car with a carburetor anymore? Does that mean am I allowed to paint my house?
No.
No? Am I allowed to dig a well? No? Well, if I'm not allowed to do those things, why aren't they spelled out the same way fire is? Fire is presumably a category of work. And if fire is a category of work, once I've been told generally don't do work, I shouldn't have to be told don't make fire. Right? If I say to you, don't beat up your brother, do I then have to tell you don't kick him? Presumably, if the Torah is not wasting words, no. The general category of don't beat up is good enough. When we get the prohibition on not murdering, it doesn't go through all the various forms of murder that someone might use. It just says don't murder. And so the rabbis say, why is this issue of fire being specified? What does it come to teach? Because it can't just be teaching don't make fire. Because don't make fire was already covered by work. Does that make sense? All right, so this is the problem of abundance. I know usually we complain that the Torah doesn't give us enough detail, and we have to squeeze and milk every word to get every last drop of meaning out of it to try and fill in everything we need. Well, here we've got this extra command of not making fire that seems totally redundant.
It is something related to when Moses go to the wild place and God said, take off your shoes.
You mean the burning bush?
The burning bush, yeah. Is this something related to the goddess image of that burning bush?
I'm not sure that we can make that connection. I think that the sages certainly think that fire is a category of work, and generally that seems to be how this is fitting in here, because as we saw, it says, seventh day you shall have a Sabbath of rest. Whoever does any work shall be put to death. You shall kindle no fire. It seems to be juxtaposed with work, rather than with an issue of the sanctity of fire, or that somehow fire is something we're not allowed to play with.
I don't know if this is where we should be going, but fire, we create fire.
Mm-hmm.
Work isn't necessarily creative, so perhaps by spelling out fire, we're talking about creative work?
So you mean the inclusion of fire is helping us to understand what type of work is being prohibited. And
bigger.
well, and that's bigger. I mean, and I think that what you're trying to say, I'm not entirely sure we can hang it on fire, but that what you're trying to say is absolutely true, which is the word work is a very, very ambiguous term. And it's a much more ambiguous term for us in the modern world than it was in the ancient world. Because in the modern world, when we think of the word work, we're usually thinking of your job, right? What you get a salary for. And that tends to be how we define work in the modern age. We are salaried employees, most of us, or we make things that we then sell for a product, sell as a product and receive some profit from. So work is associated with money in our minds. Whereas in the ancient world, most people did not have cash in their pockets at most points in their life. They worked for what they actually grew, or they worked for something that they would then trade or sell, perhaps. But the direct association with money wasn't there. So you're right that the rabbis want us to realize that work is not just an employment issue, that work is something different. It's a category that has some overlap with employment, but it has a bigger overlap with what we are doing to manipulate the world. And that's the way they go.
One, but not all. So let me try something else.
Go for it. One more try, and then
One more
we'll
try,
look
and
and
then
see
you'll
what
give the
we'll see what our
answer.
tradition has tried to say.
Well, we're also told to delight in the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
You might think that to have the utmost delight in your Shabbat, you need to light lights.
Mm-hmm.
But here we're told, don't do that.
So let's make sure, both for those who are playing at home as well as everyone else, that we all understand what Paul is going with, which is, you might think that since Shabbat is supposed to be oneg, that it is supposed to be delightful, that you need light. And indeed, the symbolism of light is used consistently throughout the Tanakh and Jewish tradition as a symbol of joy. We just read a very famous passage in the Megillah, all about the Jews having light and joy. Exactly. So that would make a lot of sense. And then we would think, well, if it's Shabbat, I better be lighting candles, not just before Shabbat, but on Shabbat. And therefore, this verse might be trying to counter us, or counter our thought, and say, no, 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 no. Even though light indeed adds to happiness, you should not be lighting it on Shabbat. That actually is a position that is taken in later rabbinic thinking, because it is specifically fighting against another position of a faction that rose inside of Judaism, known as the Karaites. Anyone here heard of the Karaites? A little bit, right? So the Karaites were a Jewish faction that developed around the 600s, 700s or so, that rejected rabbinic thinking. The Karaites essentially said this whole Mishnah stuff, this whole Talmud stuff, Midrash and all of that, it's nothing. The Tanakh is it, the Torah is it, and if you just read it plain and simple, then you will understand it. The Karaite was essentially our Protestant Reformation, which was a group of people who essentially said, go back to the text, and the text will be your guide. And you don't need tradition, you don't need the Masorah, you don't need anything else to tell you what to do. Anybody can read it and know what to do.
And they would sit in the dark on Shabbat.
Well, and from this very verse, they said, you shall kindle no fire. They took it to mean, you shall have no fire on Shabbat. Which meant even a fire that you had lit before Shabbat, you would not allow to be still burning on Shabbat. So you would go around putting out all your lamps before Shabbat began. And then you would spend the whole day of Shabbat in the dark, essentially. That was their position. There's no fire. So they took this in what they felt to be a literal meaning from this particular verse. And indeed, the rabbis of those generations who fought back against the Karaite positions pointed out that no, light is joy, and what's prohibited is lighting Shabbat candles, or lighting candles on Shabbat, but we are required to have light on Shabbat, so therefore what do we have to do? Light it before, which is one of the reasons why we light candles specifically before, and one of the reasons, more importantly, why we actually say a blessing before we do it. Because we are testifying to our the necessity of having that light as joy, and our allegiance with the rabbinic mindset that that is entirely permissible. Okay? All right, but let's take a look and see how this particular verse was handled before the Karaites started making things tricky. There we go. A few over there. All right. So we've got a couple of different positions that I have tried to summarize to show you some of the breadth, and then we're going to get down into something a bit more controversial. Okay, so try not to look beyond the first 3 little paragraphs. I know it's hard. All right, how all the handouts gone around? Yes? No? Maybe? Did I misjudge how many I send down one side? All right, so who'd like to read us a sort of an amalgamation of the positions of Rashbam and Ramban? We're all digesting? Marian, thank you.
Since we can cook on Shagim,
Chagim, the holidays, the festivals.
we might have thought we could use fire on Shabbat too. So this verse comes to prevent that error.
All right, so one of the main differences between the restrictions on work between Shabbat and other festivals, for example, Pesach, coming up around the corner, or Shavuot or Sukkot, is that on Pesach and Shavuot and Sukkot, absolutely you don't go around cutting down your wheat, you don't go around shearing your sheep, but when it comes to cooking, for the needs of that day, you're allowed to cook. Now, there are other restrictions on how you can adjust the fire or not adjust the fire, and not making fire, but using fire. It gets a little more complicated than that. But basic cooking is permissible on a Chag for the Chag. You don't get to cook for next week, but you can cook for that day.
So that's why I get to stay in the kitchen all day, because the rabbis wanted to eat and they want to make sure that they would have some food. Thank you very much, rabbis.
Well, remember, the rabbis of antiquity had no idea that it would be the women who would be the primary chefs.
I don't believe that for 1 minute.
Why would they be?
You're telling me Akiva sat in his kitchen and cooked and his wife was outside?
Akiva didn't live with his wife for decades. Of course he had to cook for himself. I'm not saying he was a good cook, I don't know. Okay. But according to Rashbam and Ramban, this verse comes to make sure we don't make a mistake. Because we might think that we can cook on Chag, so maybe we can cook on Shabbat too. And this is telling us, no. On Shabbat, absolutely not. You're not allowed to cook. There are some ways that you can warm food on Shabbat, but cooking, no cooking. Make sense? So this extra verse, this seeming redundancy of specifying fire, comes to rule out what might have been a logical but erroneous conclusion. Make sense? Yes? Okay. But we've got other explanations. Keep going, Mary.
Since lighting a fire doesn't seem like much work, it would be tempting for a smith to say, I'll get the fire started now so I can work when Shabbat is over. This verse prohibits such preparations for work.
All right, so Bechor Shor gives us a slightly different interpretation, also based upon human nature and our own proclivity to deduce rulings that benefit ourselves, which is, you think, what does it take to light a match? Or I got an electric starter in my forge, well, it's not work. And I won't actually be doing work with the fire. So why can't I just go, and then walk away and come back 2 hours later once it's all nice and hot and running, and then I can do my work straight away after doing Havdalah. What's that? Well, and that's the problem, is that starting fire, unless you're doing it with the whole, bow and string or striking rocks, is not that hard. And you might be tempted to think, if it's not hard, it doesn't count as work. And if it's not being used for work, i.e. his job as a smith, it doesn't count as work. And therefore, I'd be allowed to do it. And he argues, Bechor Shor, therefore, that the Torah added this verse in to make sure you would not come to such a conclusion. That you wouldn't think fire not used for work right now is okay. but the act of making fire itself counts as melacha, counts as prohibited labor for Shabbat. Make sense? Part of the reasons why it's very, very difficult to be a smoker and be observant. Because striking a match isn't so hard, but once you've done that, you've just ruined Shabbat. Okay, make sense? Okay, but we got another option.
Fire is usually thought of as destructive and might therefore be permitted.
Let's make sure we understand that, okay? Why would we think that something destructive would be permitted as opposed to something constructive?
Because God created the world in 6 days and rested from creation, so we shouldn't be creating.
So certainly the creation is the dominant theme of Shabbat. And in fact, labors that are destructive for no purpose other than destruction are generally, and there's a lot of specifics, so don't go running around breaking things, but are generally permitted on Shabbat. Okay, if you want to get into a bag of Doritos, are Doritos kosher? I haven't had them in years. If you want to get into a bag of Lay's potato chips, I know they've got a hechsher, you can tear that bag open, no problem, right? If you want to get into your little pack of saltine crackers, you know, you can rip open that pack, no problem. That destructive rending is okay. On the other hand, if you would like to sit and tear confetti to throw at the wedding tomorrow, no. So destruction for the purpose of building, not allowed. Destruction for the purpose of destruction, ironically, is under certain circumstances and with certain other caveats that we don't have time to go into right now, so you have to read the fine print, is permitted. So, Sforno is saying, you might have thought that since fire is generally seen as a destructive force, what with it burning stuff up, that it would be okay. However, and then I'll come to your comment.
But it is prohibited here because it is used in almost all of the categories of work.
All right, but if you look at all the categories of work, which if you flip over the page is at the very bottom, sorry for the smaller print, but trying to fit everything on one page front and back to save paper can sometimes necessitate a change in glasses prescription. Most of these categories of work, the 39 that are listed here, involve some degree of fire at some stage in the process. And Sforno is saying, you know, even though fire in its essence is a destructive force, because we channel fire creatively in almost all of these other categories, it is too much a part of those things, so don't think that you have permission to use fire for anything. Okay? You can't even use fire destructively, just hands off. Paul, you were gonna...
If tearing open that bag of Lay's potato chips is permitted, then why do synagogues go to such lengths
To pre-open things?
to have in the bathrooms individual?
Ah, okay. So it's the toilet paper question. Right. Okay, there's not a dirty word. So the issue of tearing for a constructive purpose, which is what that is considered, to be tearing a precise amount to do a particular job, is considered to be prohibited for that reason. If you were, you know, tearing it up, I'm trying to think, if there was a strip of, how can you possibly have toilet paper that wasn't being used for something that would be productive?
Something on the floor.
No, that's still being torn for a purpose. If there was, for some reason, if you had wrapped up your, there we go, okay. If prior to Shabbat, for some unknown botanical reason, you had wrapped your tomato in a layer of toilet paper, just to keep it safe and from being bruised. If you wanted to tear that toilet paper apart to get to your tomato, no problem. Because you're not tearing it for its own use, you're tearing it to get it out of the way.
That's what it is, out of the way.
Okay?
Okay, that's why even though your purpose of
Right.
tearing the potato chip is to eat the potato, you're tearing it to get it out.
Correct. And in fact, there is an important caveat to this destruction, which is that matters more for things like soda bottles nowadays with the screw caps, which is you're not allowed to tear it open or crack it open to make a new closure for a vessel. But that's a much more thorny issue. So.
Thank you, that
Not
helped.
allowed to use scissors to tear open that bag of tapes, are you?
Well, yes and no. So the issue of using an item that generally is for a primary prohibited purpose, but for something that is permitted, it gets a little bit more complicated. It gets in what we call the rules of muktzah. So for example, a hammer. Generally speaking, a hammer is used for hammering and building things, and therefore not the kind of thing you want to be using on Shabbat. You wouldn't want to just, walk around waving your hammer in the house. However, if you need the hammer to crack open a nut, that generally is considered to be an acceptable use.
The corollary is anything you do in order to eat is okay.
There are many leniencies that have to do with the direct aspect of eating, specifically on Shabbat, yes. So when it comes to like sorting between good and bad, which is another form of work that's generally prohibited, if you're sorting to take it and put it straight into your mouth, they're usually okay. If you're sorting it for the party the next day, better to leave it for after Havdalah.
So to use toilet paper, say you're going to roll somebody's lawn, that would not be
If
acceptable.
you're going to use toilet paper for what?
Rolling somebody's lawn,
You mean toilet paper in their house?
the yard, or
The trees.
gosh.
Well, you
am I
shouldn't
telling
be,
you my
well, it's
age?
vandalism anyway, so you shouldn't be doing it. and carrying it, unless you were in an Eruv, that's a great question to ask the rabbi. Rabbi, I'm going to go toilet paper someone's house tomorrow. Am I allowed to carry the toilet paper in the Eruv?
And then to tear it apart.
I think, isn't it traditional to throw it without tearing it?
It would be wrong for the person who's doing it, but right for the homeowner who tore it down.
Correct. I think that is a good distinction to make, yes. To try and move it out of the way so they can get out of their house. Now, to clean it all up on Shabbat would be prohibited.
But they have to get in and out of the house.
But to get in and out of the house would be fine. Okay. As we can see, one of the joys of studying Shabbat in particular is it makes you look at the reality around you with a set of Shabbat-colored goggles. And you begin to analyze what's happening around you in an entirely different way. Now, most of these things are theoretical. I'm sure that most of you are not thinking of throwing toilet paper in your house, but the one that happens in your own bathroom can be very important. And by the way, I personally think that if you are concerned about the tearing for toilet paper on Shabbat, that a box of tissues is much nicer than pre-tearing. Because you never know what's going to happen.
It was this great announcement when we were renovating.
Right.
We found a box that had.
Oh, with the pole, yeah. Okay. All right, so we've come up with 3 logical explanations for why fire would have been especially singled out as a category of work to prohibit on Shabbat, that if it hadn't been spelled out, we might have sort of maybe come to a completely different and false conclusion. Are we following that? Okay. Now let's go into something that may be...
This is still on the same subject.
Uh-huh.
If you light a fire
Before Shabbat.
before Shabbat and let it burn and kindle
Right.
throughout Shabbat,
Right?
is that okay?
Of course. Leaving the fire to burn and do its happy thing is just fine.
Okay.
Putting another log on, not allowed.
Okay.
Stirring the coals, not allowed. But just
Okay.
starting a fire
But if
before
you-
Shabbat.
Put the back burner of a stove on
And,
low
and leave it on,
and leave it, that's okay.
that's okay. Adjusting it,
My mother used.
not okay.
Right.
And when it comes to warming it, there's a much more complicated issue of whether you put something directly on fire or not. That's why people had what was called a blech, which is a metal sheet. Then there's other issues of whether electricity counts as the same for the purposes of rewarming. But we're not going to get into that. We'll do a practical halakha class another day. Okay. Now let's see something completely inapplicable to our modern day, and yet hopefully will still be revealing about how Judaism thinks about these issues. Who would like to take over? I'm sure Marion is exhausted from those 3 little sentences. But it's nice to get a couple extra voices in, yes? It's all spelled out, please.
Vayakhel contains 1 negative precept.
That is to say, there is only one mitzvah of itself that occurs in Vayakhel and nowhere else. And it's this one.
Which is that judges should not carry out judgments on Shabbat.
What? Did we read anything about judges? About executions?
That's their work.
What?
That's their work.
Nope.
Judges make judgments.
Remember, work is not about employment. Work is about those 39 categories on the back. And nowhere does it say you can't judge. And nowhere did we read anything about judges. So where is, this is Sefer HaChinuch. This is a book which attempts to show the positive and negative mitzvahs in every single parasha of the Torah in order. Very handy, very good read. Those of you who were here last Shabbat, we did a little section from it for the half shekel. What in the world is he dragging out judging on Shabbat from our innocent little passage? Keep reading.
In other words, if a person has incurred the death penalty in the court, they should not have put him to death on Shabbat. For it is stated, you shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations on Shabbat.
Wait a minute. The phrase "you should kindle no fire" means don't execute people on Shabbat. I mean, we had the Karaites who said don't kindle any fire means have no fire. And then we had Rashbam, and we had Bechor Shor, and we had Sforno, who said that don't kindle any fire means don't make any fire, for a variety of reasons that it needed to be explicitly stated. But now all of a sudden, don't make any fire means don't execute? How are we going to get there? Well, let's see.
And the interpretation was given in the oral tradition in this way, that the court should not execute by burning on Shabbat someone who has incurred death by burning, and the same law holds for other forms of execution.
Okay, Jewish law. We have a thing called the death penalty. In fact, we have 4 of them. 4 ways to execute someone, which are? We just mentioned one, please. Let's start with the one we mentioned.
Burning.
Okay.
Stoning.
Burning. Stoning. Not hanging, but strangulation, but that's too long. And
Chopping off.
And
Beheading.
beheading.
That's a nicer way of putting it.
Beheading. Okay, so we got 4 forms of capital punishment from the Torah, and one of them involves something super, super hot, burning, and therefore this verse is telling us don't do that one, and by extension, if we can't do this one, then we can't do those either on Shabbat. Now we know why this verse is here. It's to make sure we don't execute people with burning. By the way, how did the burning execution work for Jewish law? Are we thinking Salem witch trial in the back of your head? Are we thinking, you put someone on a stake and you put wood at the bottom and then you light the fire? And, is that what you think? What's happening for burning in Jewish law? Not according to the Mishnah and the Talmud. The Mishnah and the Talmud basically says you superheat metal, you open up their mouth, and you pour it down.
Oh, that's much.
Yeah, more you may.
Well, hold on a second. Think for a second. It is actually more humane. Okay? Because the instant it hits their insides, they're essentially dead. It's like shooting a bullet down the middle of them. Okay? It is not the agonizing of standing on a pile of wood being choked by smoke and having your skin slowly roasted off, from the outside. This would have been a relatively instant form of death. But it still needs burning, still needs fire, and therefore, according to this interpretation, this verse in the Torah teaches us nothing else except don't execute people with fire on Shabbat. And then by deduction, we get to, and don't execute them in any other way either.
What if you heated everything up and a minute to midnight? Came 12:01, it's still hot. It's now Shabbat.
Oh, but Shabbat doesn't begin at midnight.
Oh, the night, okay, just before sundown.
Just before sundown, okay.
And then you do it at sundown.
Well, there would still be some burning involved, namely the person. So you are still burning something. It's just a person. I know we don't like to think about that aspect of it, but well, you're about to
2 things.
erupt into flame.
Yeah.
This is another thing that sounds like a real slippery slope to me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, to go from fire to capital punishment is quite a stretch, and maybe we need the rabbis to tell us where we can do this with verses. But that's very far. That's very far.
Hands up. Who, when we were reading that verse, was thinking of capital punishment? No? I prepared the sheet, so of course I was.
I would have so much more easily gone back to the verse
Mm-hmm.
and said, well, this is limited to b'chol moshvotechem, throughout
Within your
your
settlements,
settlement.
right?
If you're not in your settlement, it's okay. Nobody's doing that. Nobody's suggesting that.
No.
So the rabbis are teaching us how to expand
Mm-hmm.
and where to limit.
Very true. And in fact, in the next paragraph, we'll see that the Sefer HaChinuch helps walk us through why this is allowed. Because he also recognizes, I think, that leaving it with just that opening paragraph would have left a lot of readers going, wait a minute. Who did what to who now? How did we get from here to there? It's like the equation doesn't compute. And so he takes it apart a little bit more detail for us.
We have the right to derive this matter from the verse.
We have the right to derive the matter from the verse. That means the verse is ripe for interpretation. And in fact, the verse needs to be interpreted differently than you think when you first read it. Why?
Well, you see, it is not needed for its own meaning, since it is already written elsewhere. Do not do any work on it, and fire is for the purpose of war.
Okay, so if you remember, I've already erased it. If you remember from our initial diagram, those who are doing YouTube, you can always rewind and see it. We said that fire was a subcategory of work, and therefore you shouldn't need to restate fire explicitly and independently of work. And so he's pointing out as a philosophical, theological, exegetical principle, if the Torah says something which seems unnecessary on the surface, it must be trying to teach us something else than what you thought from just reading the surface. You understand that principle? Right? You don't get to say, the Torah just said it to emphasize it. That when it comes to halakha, when it comes to figuring out the law, if it looks like a commandment, it's got to be teaching you something that you wouldn't have known without it being explicitly stated. And his argument here, based upon the Gemara, is I would not have known, I would have known that fire was prohibited even if this verse didn't exist. Because I knew work was prohibited. So therefore this must be teaching me something other than don't light a fire on Shabbat in the usual sense of that phrase. You following that? Okay, I'm not asking you to buy it yet. We'll get to this. We'll get to the sign on the dotted line later for agreeing to this deal. But I want to make sure that we're following the steps of logic here.
Hence, it was rather written to teach something separate. And so the sages explained about it, that it comes to teach us what we have stated. So also it is expressed in the Midrash Vayakhel, you shall kindle no fire. Burning of fire was included among the labors forbidden on Shabbat.
All right, let's make sure. The Mechilta is what we call a collection of Midrash Halacha. Okay? The Mechilta is one of the earliest collections of Midrashim. Now, often when we think of the word Midrash, we think of Abraham smashing his father's idols, right? We think of stories about the patriarchs, about Moses, about the Israelites, that kind of fill in the storyline, right? Well, that's Midrash Agadah. Those are Agadic Midrashes, which are trying to teach you a lesson, trying to help you understand the broader context of whatever the situation is. Midrash Halacha is, as you can guess from the name, specifically aimed at how do we understand these words and their real-world legal implications. Not just their philosophical or psychological or spiritual implications, but how we actually are going to apply the law for ourselves and our community. How do we unpack these words? Midrash Agadah, you can get 1,000 different opinions. and that's no problem. Midrash halacha, eventually you have to conclude and agree in order to have one law for your communities. So it is a different species of beast. It's also studied a lot less in general society because it's not as captivating as the story of like Abraham smashing idols. But this collection, Mechilta, is trying to do it for us for the book of Shemot, for the book of Exodus. All right, so here's how it works out.
And it went out, was singled out in order to teach us an additional point of law. What is specifically characteristic about burning with fire? It is one of the forms of deaths imposed by the court, and it does not supersede the precept of Shabbat to be able to be carried out on that day. Then, so too, all other death sentences by the court are not to supersede Shabbat.
All right, so we know that sometimes Shabbat is suspended. That is to say, the restrictions on Shabbat do get superseded for special circumstances. For example, what's that? The most famous is Pikuach Nefesh, the saving of a life, right? If somebody is in a burning building and you've got a hose, even though extinguishing fire is prohibited on Shabbat, you put out the fire to save their life, right? If somebody is dying and needs an immediate blood transfusion, you cut open the arm and you start pumping blood into them. I don't recommend you do that. I mean, you have the doctor do it. You do whatever you need to save a life on Shabbat, even if it absolutely violates one of the prohibitions of melacha, of work on Shabbat. Another example, maybe? Anyone who's had a recent boy birth in the
I
family?
would say, first of all, birth of, going into labor.
But yeah, you don't want to schedule labor on Shabbat. So yes, doing what is necessary to ensure the healthy delivery of a child and the mother, absolutely. That sort of falls under the category of pikuach nefesh. And the circumcision on Shabbat is absolutely allowed. You're not normally allowed to absolutely. You're not normally allowed to cut on Shabbat, into a human being, but. Like you wouldn't schedule elective surgery for Shabbat. Let me put it that way. However, a Brit Milah is supposed to be done 8th day, rain or shine. If you know that it is the 8th day on Shabbat, it wasn't like right during the middle of twilight or something, but 8th day is Shabbat, and you can find a moil who will be there. You do it on Shabbat. It supersedes Shabbat.
Rosh Hashanah.
Rosh Hashanah you have with Shabbat, absolutely, but what element of Rosh Hashanah do we not have on Shabbat when it happens to overlap? The blowing the shofar. We don't blow the shofar if it happens to be both Shabbat and Rosh Hashanah. That's one of the advantages of having Rosh Hashanah be 2 days. That way you always get at least 1 day with the, what?
To the circumcision.
Yes, technically yes.
That goes on.
Absolutely. The Brit Milah basically supersedes just about everything. It's,
Isn't that done often? Years ago at the synagogue?
Yes and no. Sometimes synagogues would be set up for doing that. They'd have a special chair and such.
Yeah.
But it can be done at home. It can be done anywhere. But it's 8th day. Is the wind is more important than the where.
Right.
It's that 8th day that is so critical. Okay. So.
I'm not going to expect you to answer, but going back a little, I'm curious as to how the rabbis got from the prohibition to setting a fire on Shabbat and executions and all, with all the implications, and the sacrifices they did at the temple, where they actually lit a fire on Shabbat and burned the sacrifice.
Absolutely. We'll get there.
You will?
Yeah, we'll touch on it. We're not going to go into too much detail, but yes. Let me make sure that everybody understands the seeming contradiction here, which is no fire, and that means not even executions, and yet we know that we do sacrifices on Shabbat. What gives? We'll come back to that, and if I seem to forget it, just remind me. But yes, we definitely want to mention that. But however, I want to try and juxtapose these leniencies against Shabbat, the saving of a life, the doing of a Brit Milah, for example, with this stringency here of no execution. Okay, so it wasn't just that the rabbis thought you're never allowed to violate Shabbat at all. They thought, generally, you're never allowed to violate Shabbat. There are special circumstances where you can. And even though you might have thought that the execution of a undeniably guilty criminal who is deserving of the death penalty would be the kind of thing you'd want to do as soon as possible, nevertheless, it does not push off Shabbat. Does that make sense? You're allowed to bring an infant into the brit, into the covenant, but you're not allowed to take a guilty criminal out of this world on Shabbat. All right, let's turn the page and we'll cover a little bit more ground and see what we got for our final understanding. Want to keep going?
Sure. However, with all that we have learned from this verse, it can be further interpreted as it expounded in addition. Kindling fire was singled out in order to separate labors on Shabbat into individual transgressions. In other words, if someone does major kinds of work on Shabbat in one period of forgetfulness, he becomes duty-bound to bring a chatat, sin offering for every single kind of work separately. And in the Talmud of the Westerners,
that was the colloquial term for the Jerusalem Talmud, Yerushalmi.
It was taught throughout your habitations. Ar Ila quoted Aryeh May. From here we learn about every court that it should not carry out judgment on Shabbat.
Okay, so this interpretation then gets a slight additional understanding. So one of the understandings is, of course, that the fire was also spelled out. So we would also understand that each violation of Shabbat was its own violation. Okay, the prohibition on work might make you think that if you did 30 different types of work out of the 39, that you would be responsible for just one offering, right? Because you did work. But by spelling out that fire was prohibited, this is saying, and so too all the other subcategories, meaning that if you transgress, let's go down our list, sowing, plowing, reaping, binding, threshing, winnowing, selecting, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, you have to bring a sin offering for each and every one of those, rather than just one offering for the category of work. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Additionally, we have this this idea that the phrase "in all your settlements and all your habitations" at the end means that this law is applicable no matter where Jews go. Wherever you're living, that's your habitation, and therefore you don't judge anywhere, not just restricted to what happens in the land of Israel.
What about fire for heat? And you're living in very cold areas.
Mm-hmm. Like Orlando.
Yeah. might there be different rules for people who require fire in order to live?
If you are in danger of freezing to death and there's no other way to increase the likelihood of survival, then yes, everybody agrees that you can feed the fire. However, the general received wisdom was that you could lay the fire in such a way that it would usually provide heat all the way through Shabbat, in addition to your blankets, clothes, and other such things. Or you might be in an area where you'd have a non-Jew around who would like to have you as a neighbor for the next week as well, and that they would be predisposed to making sure that your fire didn't go out as well. But generally the Jews in those areas have worked around the issues of fire. And nowadays, of course, most Jews live in areas where they're able to use timers for heat, whether it be a thermostat or whether it be a timer on a space heater.
What about blowing out candles to prevent a fire?
Blowing out candles to prevent an imminent fire? Absolutely. Blowing out candles because of the psychological perception that this may lead to a fire, even though I've lit them in the bathtub, is more frowned upon. Now, generally speaking, if there is a true phobic status where a person has a clinical condition of a fear of fire, then most people say yes, you can extinguish the fires if necessary because otherwise it will hurt them psychologically. But if it's just you're being really careful, it's better to put them someplace where you'll feel safer about them. There are lots of places to put candles that will be perfectly safe.
Except if you're picking it up, You're taking
You're
it
not
to a place
supposed
that's
to be.
safe.
Again, as Marion is pointing, we don't generally, unless for safety reasons, have to move them. And you know, really, the middle of your dining room table is not unsafe in most circumstances. If you have a cat, that may be a different issue. But you know, if you feel that uncomfortable, lighting them on the kitchen, you know, stone counter or, you know, laminate counter is perfectly permitted, rather than lighting them somewhere you feel less safe. Also, you can do candles that fit very firmly into wall sconces, that you just put the thing up on the wall. It's nailed, no way for it to be knocked
You're
over.
talking specifically about Shabbat candles.
Shabbat candles can be any size or shape. As long as they'll burn into Shabbat, you're okay.
What
So you can
about
get those little,
fire
get those little tea candles,
Right, well,
and you'll be fine. They don't have to be, you know, 12-inch tapers.
what about floral arrangements that have lit candles and they're going down?
Well, that's just silly.
Well, no, if you do like them, then.
Don't use them on Shabbat.
They're not Shabbat candles.
Don't use them on Shabbat.
Well,
I mean, I've yet to see a circumstance where the only way I can have candles on Shabbat
idea.
is with flowers.
That's right.
yes, very
So yes, if the only way you can have candles is with flowers, then you cut the candles off and you stick them on something else. But yeah, it doesn't really work that way.
You have to realize this has been bugging her for the last 45 years.
I was getting that sense, yes.
Yes.
We used to light candles on the tables, on the Shabbat table.
Right,
And when they got down to a certain place
right.
and started burning the flowers, what do?
Take the
You
flowers.
You move the flowers.
That's what got burned, so I got yelled at for doing that, it's not permissible.
Well, which is why you structure that table.
Flowers.
Right. You structure your table the same way that we try to structure our whole home for Shabbat, which is we make sure that we will avoid any circumstances
Okay.
that would force us to have to transgress.
So we stopped lighting candles then.
I wouldn't call that the ideal solution, to say the least.
I'm not talking about red candles, I'm talking about arrangements.
Oh, and not lighting candles amongst flowers on Shabbat, I think that is a very good rule of thumb. Get a couple nice, short, squat, untippable tea lights and just stick them on a counter in a heavy bowl with water filled up to the bottom of it, and you are back in safe land.
Okay.
So, and I do know people who do that. They will light candles and put them in a thing of like a Pyrex dish filled, you know, to an inch of water, and the candles will be a good couple inches out of it. No matter what happens, there's not going to be an explosion. Nothing's going to burn down. So there are ways to make it work no matter how tenuous. And again, that's why I said if it's somebody phobic, where they have an irrational fear that can't be overcome by just precautions, that would be a special set of circumstances. But I doesn't sound like you're in that category. Okay,
May I make one quick comment?
please.
We couldn't put them in the bathtub because we couldn't make a prayer.
Yes, I mean that was a bit of hyperbole. I mean, of course, we don't do brachot in the middle of a bathroom.
Right.
Technically, if it was in a bathtub that didn't have a toilet, you might be able to get away with it, but that's a whole other issue.
So that's not a solution.
But that's not an ideal solution. And you should have your Shabbat candles in the part of the house that you're likely to use on a more regular and joyful basis. Okay, let's keep running through this. Who wants to read? We're on the second paragraph on the back page. Only got 2 paragraphs left to go.
I'll read it. At the root of this precept lies the reason that the eternal Lord wished to honor this day, that all should find rest in it, even the sinners and the guilty. To give a parable, a great king summoned the people of the country one day to a feast, when he would not withhold entry from any man, and after the day of the feast, he would sit in judgment. So is this matter. The eternal Lord commanded us to hallow and honor Shabbat for our good and to make us meritorious, as I've written above. This too is for the honor of the day.
Okay, so digest that for a second. That God wants even the sinners and the guilty to find rest on Shabbat. One of the interpretations of not kindling a fire, one of the what we call musar interpretations, that is to say it's an ethical teaching, it's not necessarily meant to be law, but it's more ethical, is don't get angry on Shabbat. Don't make a fire in yourself of anger. If we are commanded to let people who deserve to be burned for the sins that they have committed to live another day rather than to ruin for them Shabbat, how much more should we make sure that when we are enjoying our Shabbat, that we don't let ourselves become inflamed with those around us, or we don't dwell on something we may be angry about from previously in the week, that we don't sit and read the newspaper in a sense of fury of how could they do blah, 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 blah. But when we sit and relax, when we come to services, we don't get angry at so-and-so who argued with us at a meeting in business last week, or we don't get angry at so-and-so, well, you know how, he or she treated their spouse. No. You can be angry with them later, we understand. I mean, anger is not a great thing, but it can't always be contained. But for 1/7 of our life, if we can put up with people that are deserving of capital punishment for their honor and the honor of the day, certainly we can put up with the people around us.
Aren't we supposed to either resolve or ignore a disagreement within the family before Shabbat starts?
Absolutely, absolutely. Creating that atmosphere of shalom bayit, of a peaceful home, is a very important aspect of creating a peaceful Shabbat. And somebody who goes through all of the mitzvot of lighting the candles and saying the Kiddush and having the lovely motzi and doing Birkat HaMazon and davening Kabbalat Shabbat and all that, but is yelling in between all of those mitzvos at their family, they're not honoring Shabbat. I mean, they're doing better than nothing, but they're not really doing Shabbat in its fullest sense. And absolutely, having that sense of peace within the family is a very important part of making Shabbat Shabbat.
For this very reason in this paragraph, I never understood the concept of a Shabbos Goy, where you go to somebody and say, you break Shabbat because I don't want to.
Well,
it seems totally contrary to this whole concept of making this a holy day for everyone.
It is, and it's a wonderful example sometimes of where permission is given in some circumstances, and then it is taken and run with to a variety of places it was never intended to be. Having somebody who is willing to help on Shabbat to do things you can't, but because they want to, is not a problem, in my opinion. And actually, it's something that can happen in a shared community, a shared neighborhood setting. Remember the rabbis, when they were talking about this, imagine living in a courtyard setting where maybe 3 of the people who in the courtyard were Jewish and 2 of them were not Jewish. Well, if the non-Jewish people wanted to do something and the Jewish people were then going to benefit from it, the Jews didn't have to go hide from them to avoid the benefit.
But if that person who was willing to do that work was Jewish, you would never ask them to do it.
And it's the asking and how the asking gets done that makes the Shabbos, the status of someone, and I don't like the phrase, the Shabbos Goy, a very intricate set of circumstances, as all human relationships are. Asking someone to do something you don't want to do is always tricky, and on Shabbat doubly so. Where it becomes more onerous, of course, is where, as a Jewish employer, you are forcing people to work in ways that they would probably not want to work. It's either you work on Shabbat or you're fired kind of thing. That becomes much more difficult. But the requirements and the relationship between Jews and non-Jews on Shabbat is a much longer conversation. But you're right, it very easily becomes distasteful. It can be done, but it is slippery to move into an improper relationship. All right. Oh, there's another hand.
As a child, I had uncles who were extremely observant.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes when I was at their house, they would ask me to turn the lights on for them.
Wow. Whoa.
That
I said, and later in life, I looked back on that and I thought, was that the right thing for them to do? But their reasoning was, you're a child and it won't count.
Okay, so the letter of the law says, yes, you have not actually committed it. You have not committed a transgression. However, the letter of the law does also say that a parent should not use their child to break the law. And more importantly, what's known as the education of a child, the chinuch, that's the name of the book that we're reading from right now, is predicated on teaching a child from the beginning the right and wrong ways to behave on Shabbat. And therefore, to encourage a child to do something that you think is prohibited, I don't think turning electric lights on is prohibited, but having a child do such a thing that you do think is prohibited is teaching them exactly the wrong message about how they should observe Shabbat when they're old enough to be personally responsible for their behavior. So I cannot, with all respect to your uncles, I cannot commend them for that, that loophole.
When I grew up and thought about it, I thought to myself that wasn't right for them to do.
I'm with you on that, yeah. All right, one more paragraph. This precept.
This precept applies when the temple is existing for males, as they are in charge of judgment, and they have to beware not to carry out a verdict of death on Shabbat. If they transgressed and ordered some person burned to death on Shabbat, they would violate this injunction, but no whiplashes would be given for it if they did no physical action in regard to it.
Meaning they make the declaration that this person will be executed, but they haven't actually started trying to carry it out.
If they did some physical action about it, for instance, if they burned him with their own hands, then if there were witnesses and a prior warning, they would be stoned to death. If they did it inadvertently, they should bring a chatat, a sin offering for atonement.
Inadvertent here, we cover things like we didn't know it was Shabbat, or we, you know, people didn't always have, you know, phones that were telling them what day it was and what hour and seconds. Or if they did it and didn't know this law, that they had forgotten that it was prohibited from doing it on Shabbat. It's a bit of a stretch, but you know, he does want to cover his bases, that technically if it was inadvertent, it was. But look for a moment, if someone decides to execute someone and says, we're not waiting until Shabbat's over, we're going to kill this guy right now. And someone says, but you know, if you kill him, that violates Shabbat. And he says, I don't care, I'm killing him anyway. They're now subject to the death penalty. So you can't say, but I was only carrying out justice. Violating Shabbat in order to do what is just, and in this particular case, it's always considered, you know, as a hypothetical given, that it is just that the person be executed. But carrying out justice in the violation of Shabbat doesn't exonerate you for violating Shabbat. That's how important Shabbat is. Make sense? Okay. Maybe an early Shabbat Shalom is appropriate.
Well, this year, Temple Israel is having, is having a